Hello, my name is Phil Chadder. I'm the chaplain to Brixton Prison, and our passage today is Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 to 17. Today our focus is on performance religion, because it's this kind of religion that we come face to face with in our Bible reading today. It's this kind of religion that confronts Jesus. In verse 14 of chapter 9, John the Baptist's disciples pop up and they ask Jesus a question. And they're not happy bunnies. Now let's just pause here before we look at what they say and engage our brains. Who are these people? John the Baptist didn't want any disciples. He didn't want people to follow him. His job was to point people to the Lord Jesus, that they might follow him. And he wanted to recede into the background. He even said, the joy of pointing to Jesus is mine and is now complete. My job is done. He must become greater. I must become less. So these disciples of John the Baptist have been told by John the Baptist that Jesus is God himself in their midst, and they've been told to follow him. Yet they like the way that John the Baptist did things. They liked his austere lifestyle, and they're bugged by Jesus. So they asked Jesus, why didn't his followers keep up the good old ways of fasting? They were, in other words, first century performance Petes. They went through the motions of religion, but missed the point. Jesus was just an enigma to them. And Jesus says to them, verse 15, think of me as a bridegroom. How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he's with them? Now, as a clergyman, I have the privilege of taking a variety of different services. But there are two services that I can never muddle up in my mind. I cannot confuse in my mind a wedding with a funeral. As I take a wedding, I look out at those smiling faces, great excitement. And the face of the bridegroom and the face of the bride radiate joy. He loves her, she loves him. It's great excitement. Impossible not to be moved by it, and all the guests share in that joy and celebrate that love. Now, I can't get that muddled up in my mind with a funeral. At a funeral I look around and there's no joy, only pain and mourning etched on people's faces. And both the joy of the wedding ceremony and the mourning of the funeral service are entirely appropriate to their own situations. And Jesus says to these so-called disciples of John the Baptist that they're behaving like mourners at a wedding. See, fasting was supposed to be an expression of our devotion to God and our distance from him. It was supposed to be a God-centered thing. But these people liked the performance of it so much that fasting became, well, the be-all and end-all. And Jesus says to them, think of me as a bridegroom. I'm here in your presence, and that is a cause for celebration, not for the mindless performance of religious practice. Yes, there'll come a time when fasting will be appropriate, but it's not now. I'm with you. Now, this would be news to John the Baptist's disciples, and it would be news to performance Pete. His heart is untouched by the Lord Jesus. He's someone of whom Jesus could say, as he did of the Pharisees, the great professional religious performers of his day, that he honours me with his lips, but his heart is far from me. Now remember that for the worst of sinners, Jesus always has a word of kindness. He holds out to them an open door. But to people who perform religion, without their hearts being wedded to him, To them, Jesus gave only dire warnings. We're going to note very quickly 3 things about performance religion, since it's so vexed Jesus. First, it's very common. It's one of the great family diseases of the human race. It can rear its head in any church. You can tell when it happens because the way things are done suddenly becomes much more important than why you are doing it. Remember that church is there for us to come together, to celebrate our heart devotion to Jesus. We come together to glorify God, to encourage one another, to learn from him. That's what church is for. But I know of a church which split itself, it divided itself over the issue of whether to sit on pews or chairs when they came together. Now, Performance Pete would understand that. It's an important question to someone like him. To him, the way you do things is all important, and he's long forgotten why he's doing it. And Performance Pete will get very worked up about the mechanics of things, or whether hymns or songs are sung, whether robes are worn or not, whether the service is traditional or informal or contemporary, whether there's a choir or no choir, drums or no drums. Now, we all have our preferences over these things, but for Performance Pete, these are not the dominant questions. And Performance Pete is not a one-off. Performance religion is common, and we need to examine ourselves and root out the Performance Pete in ourselves. So it's common. Secondly, it's dangerous. It poses a very real threat to our spiritual health. Familiarity with the form of religion, while neglecting its reality, is like an inoculation against the real thing. Few people, I think, are harder to reach with the good news of Jesus than Performance Petes. They go through the motions of religion, but they don't engage their hearts. Their hearts are not wedded to Jesus. And that can be an inoculation against the real thing. And Jesus goes on in his conversation with these slightly ridiculous disciples of John the Baptist to say that he can't be domesticated and slotted in to their performance religion. He compares performance religion with an old garment and with an old wineskin. Sew a new piece of cloth onto an old one, wash the garment, and the old cloth will be ripped apart. Put new wine that still has some fermenting to do into inflexible old wineskins, and the old skins won't cope. They won't cope with the expansion, and they'll burst. See, Jesus cannot be domesticated and compartmentalized into our own systems. Jesus isn't compatible with performance religion. Think of me as a bridegroom, he says. You're to love me. I'm here for a love relationship. So performance religion is common, dangerous, and finally, it's just plain silly. What comfort can Performance Pete have in the face of the ultimate questions that life throws at us from performance religion? None. One writer once said that you cannot warm your hands on a painting of a fire. You cannot feed your tummy on the photograph of a feast. And performance religion cannot bring peace and comfort to the soul. It can't. It's a dead thing. It's a very silly thing. So what test can we apply to each of ourselves today to see whether we're a Heartfelt Harry or a Performance Pete? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? We're to examine our heart. The true Christian is the Christian in his or her heart. The heart is the test. It's not enough to be able to say the creed without crossing our fingers. Even the devil can do that. He knows those things to be true. God looks on the heart. So are you a heartfelt Harry? Or are you a performance Pete? Remember that the outward things of Christianity, baptism, communion, being part of a church, giving, reading the Bible, and so on, none of these things will take a person's soul to heaven unless that person's heart is right before God. Well, how can a performance Pete become a heartfelt Harry? It is possible. How so? Think of me as a bridegroom, says Jesus.